Liam Drake's defeat of the Shadow Stalker. The crimson sun was sinking low, casting long shadows over the alien terrain as the fire crackled, sending sparks into the deepening purple sky. Liam Drake, a soldier hardened by countless battles, sat by the campfire, his face lit by the warm glow. With a grin, he tore into the thick leg of a shadow stalker, the apex predator of the planet. The meat was perfectly cooked, and the rich, gamey flavor made his taste buds sing as the juice ran down his chin. He wiped it away casually with the back of his hand, savoring the victory as much as the feast. Behind him, the remains of the creature, easily the size of a small elephant, slowly turned on a makeshift spit. Roasting in the firelight. The rich scent of the sizzling meat mixed with the strange, sweet aroma of the local vegetation, creating a heady blend that seemed to fill the entire alien landscape. His armor, scratched and dented from the recent battle, spoke of the fight he'd just won. The torn undersuit beneath revealed fresh scrapes and bruises, evidence of the brutal encounter. But to Drake, it was all worth it. The meat was absolutely fantastic, and the adrenaline from the fight still coursed through his veins. He was just about to take another bite when movement at the edge of the camp caught his eye. Standing there, illuminated by the last rays of sunlight, was perhaps the most stunning being he had ever seen. Avia, the alien lieutenant of the Nixon species, watched him with wide, purple eyes filled with disbelief. Her silver-white hair shimmered in the dying light, creating a halo effect around her sharp, elegant features. She wore form-fitting black armor that left little to the imagination, her gaze locked on the massive leg of the shadow stalker in his hands, clearly struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't every day a human casually devoured the planet's deadliest predator. Finally, Avia's voice broke the silence, her translator converting her melodic, alien tongue into crisp English. "What are you eating?" Drake, still savoring his bite, smiled widely and held up the meat. "Dinner," he said with a shrug, his voice rich with amusement. "Want some?" "There's plenty to go around." Avia's jaw tightened, and her eyes flickered between the shadow stalker's remains and the confident human sitting before her. "That's a shadow stalker's leg," she said, stepping closer, her voice almost reverent. She seemed to have trouble believing the reality of the scene unfolding before her. Drake took another bite and chewed thoughtfully, never breaking eye contact with her. "Yep. Nasty piece of work," he replied casually, tossing the bone back onto the fire. "Tried to ambush me while I was checking the perimeter. Had to teach it some manners." Avia took a step closer, her movements graceful despite the disbelief still evident in her expression. "You killed a shadow stalker, alone?" she asked, the incredulity in her voice unmistakable. Drake chuckled, leaning back against the log he was sitting on. "Well, yeah," he said, gesturing toward his combat knife and plasma pistol lying nearby. "Used these mostly. Though, I'll admit, there was some hand-to-hand involved. The bastard was tough, I'll give him that." A flicker of admiration crossed Avia's face before she recovered, her purple eyes still wide with wonder. "Hand-to-hand with a shadow stalker," she repeated, as if the idea itself was utterly foreign to her. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless." Drake's grin widened, his blue eyes sparkling with a mixture of amusement and arrogance. "I'll let you decide. Either way, it's not every day you get to eat a piece of a creature that could kill you in a heartbeat, right?" Avia didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there, taking in the sight of him, this human who had just feasted on the very predator her species had learned to fear. She found herself torn between disbelief and awe, her thoughts racing. What kind of human was this? One who didn't flinch in the face of death, who casually consumed the very creature she had only heard stories about. Drake, oblivious to her internal conflict, leaned forward, offering her a piece of the meat. "Come on," he said, flashing her a grin that could melt the coldest of hearts. "Don't tell me you're going to stand there and judge me when you could be enjoying some of the best meat on the planet." He held the meat out to her, the steam rising from it invitingly. Avia's hesitation was palpable. It wasn't just the fact that she was facing a human who had killed one of their planet's deadliest predators, there was something deeper about him, something that drew her in. Despite her training and the stories she had heard about humans, she couldn't help but be fascinated by him. This human, who made the impossible seem casual, who treated the most lethal creatures like mere challenges to conquer. Her eyes met his again, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. For a brief moment, their world, the one full of dangers, predators, and unspoken rules, seemed to fade into the background. The alien encounter, the air between them crackled with an unspoken tension as Avia stood at the edge of the camp, her eyes locked on the scene before her. She was a striking figure, her silvery white hair caught the last rays of the crimson sun, creating an ethereal glow around her sharp, elegant features. The form-fitting black armor she wore clung to her lithe frame, a perfect reflection of her species' grace and deadly efficiency. But none of that seemed to matter as she watched in utter disbelief. Liam Drake, a human, sat casually by the fire, tearing into the massive leg of a shadow stalker, the very predator that her people had learned to fear. Its obsidian scales gleamed in the dying light, and its razor-sharp quills seemed to still shimmer with the threat of death. Yet here was Drake, chewing on the creature's meat as if it were nothing more than a piece of game, a look of pure satisfaction on his face. Avia took a hesitant step forward, her purple eyes narrowing as she processed what she was witnessing. She had been sent here to monitor Drake's progress on the planet, not to watch him break every assumption she had ever held about humanity. How could this human, this outsider, so casually feast on something that had hunted her people for generations? That's a shadow stalker's leg, she said, her voice soft, almost reverent, as she finally found her words. Her translator converted the melodic Nixon language into perfect English. But the shock still lingered in her tone. Drake didn't seem fazed by her presence. He merely looked up from his meal, grinning as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "Dinner," he replied with a casual shrug. His voice was rich and warm, completely at ease in the face of the alien's disbelief. "Want some? There's plenty to go around." The offer hung in the air for a moment, and Avia hesitated. The idea of sharing a meal with a human, especially one who had so ruthlessly slain this terrifying predator, seemed wrong. Yet there was something in his demeanor that disarmed her, something about the way he didn't seem at all fazed by the danger this creature represented. She took another step forward, her gaze flicking from the meat to Drake's face. "You killed it? Alone?" she asked, her voice filled with awe and confusion. "How?" Drake chuckled, leaning back against the log and wiping his hands on the leg of his torn suit. "Yeah, alone. Wasn't easy, but I managed." He gestured to his weapons, his plasma pistol and combat knife, lying nearby. "Mostly these. Though, I'll admit, there was some hand-to-hand involved. This bastard was tougher than I expected." Avia's sharp features tightened slightly, her mind racing as she processed his words. In all her years of training, she had never met a human like this. Her people, Nixons, had learned to avoid shadow stalkers. They hunted in packs, used their surroundings to their advantage, and were nearly impossible to kill. The idea that a single human could defeat one, let alone eat it, went against everything she had been taught. "You fought it hand to hand?" she repeated incredulously. "In close combat? With a shadow stalker?" Her voice rose in pitch, a mixture of disbelief and respect lacing her words. It was almost impossible for her to fathom. Drake's grin only widened, his blue eyes sparkling with a mixture of arrogance and amusement. "Yep. After I ran out of plasma shots, it was either that or become its next meal. Not much choice in the matter," he said, biting off another chunk of the meat. Avia watched him, her eyes flickering with a mix of curiosity and something else, something she couldn't quite place. Here was a human who didn't just survive the deadliest creatures on her world, he dominated them. It wasn't just the fact that he had killed a shadow stalker. It was the ease with which he spoke about it, the nonchalance in his voice, and the way he had treated the creature like any other kill. She felt a strange pull in her chest, a curiosity that hadn't been there before. She had been sent here to observe, to monitor. But now, in the face of this human, she realized she was experiencing something far more complex. The stories she had been told about humanity, how they were fragile, how they could be easily overpowered by the creatures of this world, were now unraveling before her eyes. Your warriors tell stories about these creatures, she said, her voice quieter now. They hunt in packs, they're nearly impossible to kill, and they've wiped out entire settlements. Her words felt strange on her tongue, foreign in the context of the human sitting before her. And yet, you killed one alone. Drake's eyes softened, but only slightly. Impossible to kill? Yeah, that's an exaggeration. Everything dies if you hit it hard enough, in the right spots. He took another bite of the meat, savoring it. And besides, I've got more experience with these things than I care to admit. Sometimes it's not about strength, it's about outlasting them, figuring out their weaknesses. Avia couldn't help but watch him, captivated by his confidence, his absolute certainty. He had a power about him, not just physical, but something deeper. It was in the way he moved, the way he spoke, and the way he faced danger without flinching. There was no fear in him. And somehow, that made him even more dangerous. Really? She asked, the doubt lingering in her voice. And yet, your people are not apex predators on your own world. You're not the strongest, nor the fastest. Drake's grin widened, and for a moment, there was a flash of something primal in his eyes. We didn't get to the top of our food chain by being nice. We're survivors, and survival is what matters most. Avia wasn't sure whether she was more amazed by his words or by the underlying truth in them. She had expected humans to be fragile, easily frightened, and full of doubt. But what she saw before her was something entirely different, something that both frightened and intrigued her. So what are you? She asked, her voice lower now. A survivor? Or a predator? Drake leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. A little of both. Depends on the day, he said, his voice low and playful. The air between them shifted, thick with something unspoken. It was no longer just about the shadow stalker or the meal he had devoured. It was about them, two beings from vastly different worlds, connected by a moment that neither of them could have predicted. Perhaps, Avia said, her voice barely a whisper, you're more than I expected. Drake's grin softened into something more genuine. Yeah, he said, lifting his hand toward her. I tend to do that, and with that simple gesture, their worlds collided, and something began to stir between them, something that would change the course of their paths forever. Avia's intrigue and growing attraction, as the campfire crackled and the last of the crimson sun's rays faded behind the horizon, Avia found herself unable to look away from the human sitting before her. She had come here to observe him, to report on his survival skills and his ability to navigate this alien world. But now, something far more complex was unfolding between them, something she couldn't have predicted, something that caught her off guard. Drake, with his confidence and the easy way he handled the brutal creatures of this planet, seemed to be the very definition of control. He moved with a grace that belied his strength, each action deliberate, each movement smooth and calculated. There was a rawness to him, an energy that she couldn't quite place, something primal that seemed to flow just beneath the surface. It was like watching a predator at the top of its game, never losing focus, never letting anything get in its way. She watched him tear into the shadow stalker's leg, his teeth sinking into the meat with a quiet satisfaction, and felt an unexpected stir in her chest. How could he be so unbothered? How could someone from a species so fragile, so human, be so unafraid of this deadly planet? Her eyes flickered down to the scars and bruises on his body, remnants of the fight he had just won, and she couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration. Here was a man who had fought, and won, against one of the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. He was strong, unshakable, and utterly fearless. His very presence seemed to fill the space around him, commanding attention without saying a word. Avia found herself captivated. It wasn't just his physical prowess or his strength. It was the way he held himself, the quiet confidence that exuded from him with every move. And as she stood there, frozen in place by the growing tension between them, she realized something she hadn't intended to: she was drawn to him. Despite the differences between their species, despite the vast gulf between their worlds, she felt a magnetic pull towards this human. Her heart raced slightly faster, and for the first time in a long while, she found herself intrigued, curious about someone beyond the boundaries of her own kind. The way he had fought off the shadow stalker, the way he had so casually torn into its flesh as if it were nothing, there was something intoxicating about it. Drake, seemingly unaware of the turmoil he was causing inside her, glanced up and caught her gaze. His blue eyes met hers with a quiet intensity, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. The flickering flames of the campfire cast shadows over his face, highlighting the cuts and bruises that marked his skin. But despite it all, there was a sense of tranquility about him, a calm in the storm of danger they had just faced. Avia's breath caught in her throat as she realized that she had been staring at him for far too long. She quickly looked away, trying to regain her composure, but the feeling lingered. What is this? She thought. This attraction. This strange pull toward him. She had spent her entire life focused on duty, on the mission. She was a warrior, trained to observe, to assess, to remain detached. But here, in this moment, with the campfire crackling softly between them, something had shifted. Her control, usually so effortless, felt fragile. And it scared her. Drake broke the silence, his voice low and teasing. "You sure you don't want some of this?" he asked, holding up the shadow stalker meat. Avia shook her head slightly, her thoughts still tangled with the feelings she couldn't name. "You've already made quite an impression on me," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was talking about the meat, or him. Drake's grin widened, his blue eyes sparkling with amusement. "Impression, huh? Guess that's one way to put it." He seemed completely at ease, as if he were the one in control. He's confident, Avia thought, too confident, but there was something undeniable about him, something that made her wonder if, for once, she might want to give up the control she held so tightly to. And as the firelight danced around them, she realized with growing clarity that she wasn't just fascinated by him anymore. She was beginning to feel something deeper, something far more dangerous. The arrival of the Storm and Shadow Stalker pack, the tranquility of the moment shattered like glass. A sudden drop in the air pressure, a thick, oppressive silence that clung to the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Avia's eyes immediately darted to the horizon, her instincts kicking into high gear. She had trained for this. Her senses were sharp, finely tuned to the world around her, and something was wrong. Drake, ever the calm figure, stood up in one fluid motion. His trained eyes scanned the landscape, his sharp instincts kicking in as well. Without a word, he moved toward his weapons, securing his armor with practiced precision. The peaceful camp had turned into a scene of alert tension within seconds. "We've got company," Drake muttered, his voice low and steady, but his gaze never leaving the distance. Avia stiffened, her purple eyes narrowing as she read the atmosphere around them. The warning signs were unmistakable. The local vegetation had stopped swaying despite the absence of wind, and a deep, eerie quiet had settled over the camp. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise, the silence suffocating. The growls reached them first, low, guttural, and hungry. Then another growl. And another. "Shadow stalkers," Avia whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "A whole pack." Drake nodded grimly, his fingers brushing over his combat knife and plasma pistol. "They must have caught the scent of their dead packmate," he said. "And now they're coming for us." The first flash of lightning cut across the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The megastorm was bearing down on them faster than anticipated, bringing with it sheets of stinging, acidic rain that would soon make visibility near impossible. But what concerned Drake more than the storm was the pack that had closed in on them. "Get to the shelter," he ordered, his voice steady, cutting through the rising panic. I'll cover you. Avia's breath caught in her throat as she watched him move with precision, his every action honed from years of training and experience. She nodded, her own training kicking in, and together, they sprang into action. The growls grew louder as the shadow stalkers closed in, their massive forms looming out of the darkness, eyes glowing in the storm's faint light. The creatures were nearly twice the size of the largest predators on Earth, with obsidian scales and jagged quills running down their spines. Their eyes burned with a primal hunger, their growls sending a chill down Avia's spine. Without hesitation, Drake grabbed her hand, and in one swift motion, they sprinted toward the reinforced shelter. Their footsteps were drowned out by the thunder as the storm raged around them, the shadow stalkers hot on their heels. Behind them, the pack of creatures burst from the underbrush, their massive forms charging at full speed. Drake shoved Avia toward the shelter, his body following immediately behind as he turned to face the oncoming pack. His combat knife gleamed in the dim light, ready for the fight ahead. Go! He shouted, his voice carrying a sense of finality. Avia dove inside just as the first of the shadow stalkers lunged. The door slammed shut with a violent thud, the reinforced metal groaning under the weight of the creature's assault. Drake's blade found its mark in the creature's eye, and it fell with a piercing shriek, momentarily blocking the pack's advance. Breathing heavily, Avia slammed the door shut from the inside, locking it with a quiet but heavy finality. The shadow stalkers continued to attack, their claws scraping against the metal as their frustration mounted. But inside, there was a silence, a tense stillness that was only broken by the heavy sound of their breathing. Avia turned to find Drake standing close, his face set with grim determination, but his eyes now meeting hers with a depth she hadn't expected. The danger had passed, for the moment, but the growing intensity between them had just begun to shift. I think we're stuck here for a while, Drake muttered, his voice rough with adrenaline, and as the storm continued to rage outside, Avia realized something. She wasn't just stuck with a human. She was stuck with someone who made her feel alive, someone who made her see the world differently. And despite the looming danger, despite the threat of the shadow stalkers outside, there was nowhere she would rather be than here, with him. The intimate shelter moment, the storm outside raged with unrelenting fury, the wind howling like a creature in pain, and the shadow stalkers continued their attack against the reinforced shelter. Inside, however, there was a strange stillness, a charged silence that hung between Drake and Avia. Both of them were breathing heavily, their bodies pressed close together in the confined space. Avia's silver hair, now damp from the acid rain, clung to her face, her purple eyes wide with a mix of exhaustion and something deeper, something neither of them had yet acknowledged. Drake stood close, his muscular frame almost filling the small shelter, his combat suit torn and smeared with dirt and blood. Yet there was an undeniable calm in his presence, his usual smirk replaced with a focused intensity as he scanned the surroundings for any more signs of danger. But despite his outward control, his eyes kept drifting toward her, drawn to the subtle way she moved, to the strength in her posture even as she caught her breath. Avia stood just inches from him, her heart still racing, the adrenaline from the battle not yet dissipating. She hadn't expected to feel such a connection to this human, this warrior who had effortlessly taken down the planet's most dangerous predator. Yet, here in this quiet, dangerous space, she couldn't deny the pull between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the storm and their own breathing. And then, without thinking, Avia found herself taking a step closer, her gaze locked onto Drake's blue eyes. There was something magnetic in them, a depth that made her feel like she was staring into the very core of who he was. The silent intensity between them grew, and Avia felt her control slip, her own emotions swirling in a way she couldn't explain. Drake must have felt it too because in an instant, he was closing the gap between them. His hand brushed against hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her body, and before she could stop herself, she found herself pulling him closer. Their lips met in a kiss, soft at first, tentative, as if both of them were questioning the moment. But the hesitation quickly faded as their shared experiences, their fight for survival, and their undeniable chemistry took over. The kiss deepened, a rush of passion and heat flooding through both of them, and for a few seconds, the outside world ceased to exist. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads resting together, breath coming in short, urgent bursts, Avia's heart pounded harder than it had in the heat of battle. She wasn't sure where this was leading, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All she knew was that in the chaos and violence of this world, she had found something she hadn't expected, something worth fighting for. The Shadow Stalker pack adaptation. Days passed, but the memory of their harrowing escape and the kiss they had shared lingered in the air between Drake and Avia, both of them distracted by the undeniable pull that had begun to form between them. But soon, a more immediate concern took over, an even greater challenge that neither of them could ignore. The Shadow Stalker pack wasn't just a group of mindless killers, they had begun to adapt. The evidence was everywhere, their attacks had grown more strategic, their coordination more efficient. What was once a group of solitary, dangerous beasts had evolved into a terrifyingly organized force. Drake was the first to recognize the change. His eyes narrowed as he studied the patterns of the Shadow Stalkers' movements. They had learned to attack in sync, exploiting weaknesses in their prey's defenses. They were becoming smarter, almost too smart. His instincts kicked in as he quickly assessed the situation, and it was clear that if they didn't adapt their strategies, they would all be in serious danger. These creatures are evolving, he said, his voice tense with realization. They're using tactics now, advanced pack coordination. We can't just fight them the same way anymore. Avia stood by his side, her purple eyes scanning the horizon as she processed the information. Her training as a Nixon warrior was focused on adaptability. But she had never faced an enemy that could evolve as quickly as this. The Shadow Stalkers were no longer just the apex predators, they were learning, evolving, and pushing their species to a new level of deadly efficiency. We'll need to change our approach, Avia said, her voice calm but edged with urgency. Our warriors can't fight them head-on. They need new tactics, new strategies. Drake nodded, his mind already racing through potential counter-strategies. The human military had faced similar situations before, creatures that adapted to their strategies, and Drake had learned over the years how to fight back by thinking several steps ahead. He wasn't about to let these creatures outsmart them. First, he said, turning to Avia, we need to train your warriors to think like predators. We can't rely on brute force anymore. We need precision, coordination, and a whole lot of patience. These things are smart. So we need to be smarter. With that, Drake took charge, training Avia's warriors in new counter-strategies, teaching them to use the terrain to their advantage. To outthink the Shadow Stalkers, and to strike when the creatures least expected it. The process wasn't easy, and the stakes were higher than ever. But the bond between Drake and Avia grew stronger as they worked side by side, developing new techniques, adjusting their plans, and sharpening their warriors' skills. The Shadow Slayer nickname, after the intense training and the countless battles they had fought together, Drake had earned the respect of every warrior under Avia's command. But it was during the battle to defend the Nixon settlement from an all-out Shadow Stalker assault that he truly cemented his legacy. The creatures had evolved yet again, their tactics more refined, their attacks more brutal. The settlement's defenses were holding, but just barely. The Nixon warriors, though skilled, were struggling to keep up with the relentless wave of Shadow Stalkers. And that's when Drake's leadership truly shone. With Avia by his side, they led the charge. Drake, his combat instincts sharpened by years of fighting and surviving, guided the warriors through the chaos. His quick thinking and adaptability were key to their success. Every move he made, from his commanding presence to his precise strikes, demonstrated his ingenuity and experience in dealing with predators. Together, they coordinated their efforts, using the very same tactics they had developed during training to outwit and outlast the attacking pack. The battle was fierce, but with Drake's strategic mind and Avia's unparalleled agility, the Shadow Stalkers were defeated, just as they had been before. As the smoke cleared and the settlement's warriors stood victorious, the Nixon commander, Thuran, looked at Drake with a newfound respect. "You've done the impossible," Thuran said, his voice heavy with admiration. You've defeated the Shadow Stalkers, and you've taught us to do the same." From that moment on, Drake was given a new title, one that would echo through the Nixon world for years to come. The Shadow Slayer. The name spread quickly, and as his reputation grew, so did his partnership with Avia. They had not only survived together, they had become an unstoppable team. And with every battle they fought, every victory they claimed, their bond deepened, transforming from mere allies into something far more profound. Together, they were rewriting the rules of survival, and creating a legacy that would forever change the fate of their worlds. 8. The rising relationship between Drake and Avia. As the days passed and their alliance against the Shadow Stalkers continued to thrive, something deeper began to form between Drake and Avia. The battles they fought together, side by side, began to solidify a bond that neither of them could ignore. What started as mutual respect for each other's strength and skill slowly transformed into something more profound, something that neither had expected. In the heat of the most intense battles, when survival seemed uncertain and the shadow of death loomed over them, they had each other to lean on. Their teamwork was seamless. Avia's grace and precision complemented Drake's raw power and tactical brilliance, and they moved together with such synchronicity that it was hard to imagine them ever fighting alone. They became a force to be reckoned with, not just for their ability to kill Shadow Stalkers, but for the way they supported one another. There were quiet moments too, ones where the fighting subsided and they shared a rare sense of peace amidst the chaos. Whether it was sitting by a crackling fire after a battle, exchanging stories of their past, or simply exchanging a knowing look in the midst of another mission, those moments became something both of them cherished. Avia had never imagined she would find solace in the presence of a human, especially not one as unyielding as Drake, but here she was, finding herself drawn to him more and more with each passing day. Drake, in turn, found a rare kind of peace with Avia. Despite the danger that surrounded them, despite the endless battles and the ever-looming threat of the Shadow Stalkers, there was something about being with her that made him feel grounded. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. And Avia, with her strength and beauty, was at the center of it. When they stood together, facing the endless dangers of the planet, they both realized that it wasn't just about the battle anymore. It was about each other. It was the way they looked out for one another, the way their eyes met in the middle of a fight and everything else faded away. They were partners, unwavering and unstoppable. Not just in battle, but in everything else. The bond that had begun as mere cooperation had blossomed into something undeniable. Their growing love had begun to shape the very fabric of their shared journey. The world around them might have been unforgiving, but with each other, they found something worth fighting for. Drake's proposal. It was on a quiet evening, just after the last battle, when Drake knew, deep in his gut, that he couldn't let this moment slip by. He couldn't just be a warrior fighting for survival. He had found something more, someone more, in Avia. Their shared victories, their moments of silent understanding, and the raw, undeniable connection they had forged made him realize that there was a future for them beyond the battlefield. As the sun dipped low, casting the world in hues of crimson and gold, Drake took a deep breath. The storm clouds that had once darkened their skies were gone, replaced by a sense of calm. The Shadow Stalker threat was far from over, but for once, they were safe. Avia stood at the edge of the camp, watching the sunset, her silver hair glowing in the fading light. Drake approached her, his heart beating louder with each step. His hand found something tucked away in his gear, an object that he had carried with him for a while now, something that had taken on new meaning as his relationship with Avia grew. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, even in the chaos of war, and now, it was time. "Avia," he said softly, drawing her attention. She turned, her eyes locking with his, the familiar purple gaze holding a depth of understanding between them. Without a word, he took her hand in his and pulled out a ring, an intricately crafted band made from the bone of a Shadow Stalker, set with precious gems from both Earth and Nixon. The ring was a symbol, not just of their bond, but of everything they had overcome together. "Avia," Drake continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you've shown me what it means to fight for something greater than myself. You've taught me to see the world through new eyes. You're my partner, my equal, and I can't imagine facing the future without you by my side. Avia's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the ring, the significance of the moment washing over her. Despite the chaos that surrounded them, this felt like the most important battle of all, one that transcended their species, their worlds, and everything they had ever known. Will you marry me? Drake asked, his voice low, his eyes locked on hers with a raw intensity that left her breathless. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The world seemed to stop, as though holding its breath. And then, with a smile that could light up the darkest sky, Avia stepped forward, her hand reaching out to accept the ring. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. In that moment, amidst the shadows of war and the weight of the universe, they found something sacred, something that no battle could ever take away. Their love had grown, had flourished, and now, they were bound together in a way that no enemy could break. The earth-bound future, the days after the proposal passed in a blur of preparations. The Shadow Stalkers were still out there, still posing a threat to the Nixon world, but now there was something else to fight for, each other, their future. Drake's recall to Earth was imminent. He had completed his mission, and the military needed him back. But the thought of leaving Avia, leaving behind everything they had built together, gnawed at him. As the day of departure grew closer, the weight of the decision pressed heavily on both of them. The planet they had fought so hard to protect, the bond they had forged, and the love that had blossomed between them, how could that be part of a life that was bound to Earth? How could they continue their journey together when one of them was bound by duty? Sitting together one night, the silence between them felt heavier than ever. The only sound was the wind whispering through the alien landscape, the distant crackle of the fire between them. Avia had been so strong throughout the journey, so fierce in the face of danger. But now, even she couldn't hide the uncertainty in her eyes. You're leaving, she said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness but also understanding. Drake looked at her, his blue eyes dark with the weight of his decision. I don't want to, he confessed, his voice rough. But I have to. Earth wants me to lead a new division. There's too much at stake, and they need me back. She nodded, her heart heavy but proud. I know. And you'll do what you've always done, fight, lead, survive. But what about us? Drake reached out, his hand cupping her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. This doesn't end here, he said firmly. You're coming with me. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, her breath caught. Earth? She asked, incredulous. They'll never accept a Nixon. Drake smiled, a grin full of that familiar confidence. Let them try. We've proven we can break the rules before. Why not do it again? The tension melted between them as she placed her hand over his, leaning into his touch. I've never been one to shy away from a challenge, she said with a small smile. Together, they stood, facing an uncertain future, but knowing that their bond, what they had fought for, was strong enough to defy anything the world or Earth could throw at them. And with that, they stepped into their future together, a future that would redefine what it meant for humans and Nixons to stand side by side. Their journey was just beginning, and it would take them to places neither of them could have ever imagined. But as long as they were together, there was no challenge too great to overcome.